Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob. How you doing?
I cannot complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. Available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. Amazingly. And you are Josh Summers. And those are my dogs. Can you hear those? They just started barking.
I can.
The male person may have arrived. And you have been kind enough to suggest that we do a series of conversations, of which this is conversation number 2, in which I get all self-indulgent and flesh out my worldview.
Which we're loosely calling the Dharma of Bob.
Which I'm happy to say is your idea. Not that I don't like the phrase, but I think I would like to muster the usual false humility and say, aw shucks, should we really give it a name that has my name in it? But you insist, and so okay, that's okay. That's fine.
You know, it's just easier for generations to come to have a big heading for the whole thing.
And they'll know who that refers to, because it's not like there's more than one Bob.
No, by that point, your Bobness will have reached apotheosis.
There'll be like two. It'll be like Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, like Bob of New Jersey and Bob of whoever. So anyway, thank you for this. And the first one of these we did is available. I think we'll probably link to it in show notes or something. In any event, you could find it on YouTube by Googling our names and the term, the Logos, Logos, because that's what we talked about. And just to briefly recap, very briefly, the Logos, it's an ancient concept. The basic idea is there's a kind of logic running through, in some sense, governing human history and history more broadly, the history of the world, that doesn't govern so strictly perhaps as to rule out human agency, but does still shape the contours of our options, maybe in some sense, and is a manifestation of a larger purpose, a higher purpose, classically conceived, a divine purpose, in any event, a purpose that is in some sense associated with a good. That's why they call it divine, I guess. We talked about the version of the Logos associated with Philo of Alexandria, who lived 2,000 years ago. My contention is that there's a version of the Logos that you could talk about today, kind of updated, that is scientifically respectable. And that one thing that implies is that you could have a worldview that is scientifically respectable, but also involves the notion of some larger purpose unfolding. And the last thing I'd say is that I think this is, if you had such a worldview, which we will try to continue to spell out in its various ramifications, it would help you make sense of the current world, including headlines we're seeing and things. That's my contention, and predicaments we famously face right now as human beings. So that's the Logos. Those are my dogs again.
Your dogs like the summary you just gave. Would you say the Logos, you refer to it as the algorithm of the human history, but is it constrained to that only in your view? Do you have a looser?
Certainly not. Now, of course, it's classically conceived. I mean, Philo of Alexandria was Jewish, so he would have thought of humans as having existed pretty near the beginning. He didn't have any, modern notion of evolution. But I think in the updated version of the Logos, you would say that biological evolution is itself part of the Logos, big part. If you want to think of the Logos as in some sense an algorithm, natural selection embodies. I don't want to say it's all of the algorithm, but it's in a way the central part from our point of view. There was, of course, a history before natural selection, that involved, you could say prebiotic evolution or something, the evolution of the cosmos. And there are people who work these into a single kind of worldview, of course, prebiotic. There have been these cosmic visions, prebiotic. I think maybe Teilhard de Chardin, who is relevant to this conversation, thought that way. And in any event, you would then break evolution, break post-biotic evolution up into biological evolution and what we call cultural evolution, that is to say the evolution of technologies, ideas, and so on, and see those as a kind of a single unfolding.
Would you feel comfortable putting psychological evolution into that equation?
Yeah, I mean, I think cultural evolution involves psychological evolution. We are, in some sense, very different beings from even, my father. I mean, I'm in some sense a different being from millennials, It's like, and I kind of mean that. I mean, technology, or let's just take a clear example. Let's say before the invention of agriculture, when everyone was a hunter-gatherer. Just a different worldview from living in a modern, technological, somewhat secular society. And I think, to maybe get closer to what you have in mind, I don't know, I think we have some psychological evolving to do if we are going to, in a sense, kind of wisely accept the guidance of the Logos and adapt to our current moment wisely.
Yeah. And in terms of your worldview, what we're loosely calling the Dharma of Bob, it occurred to me that your understanding, in your worldview, like the key features of your worldview are essentially like signposts on the evolution or within the evolution of the Logos. So, and you kind of just named a few: biological evolution, cultural evolution, then psychological evolution, technological evolution, and all of these things feed into how the Logos has evolved through millennia, and updated itself, and then how that, I think, in your worldview, it's like this necessitates a consideration of all those elements to fully understand the picture of, say, something like where we are now. Yeah,
I think if I. Or maybe you should say a little more about that. I think the answer is yes, but do you want to elaborate?
Well, yeah. I mean, you can have a very constrained idea of what the Logos is in kind of a theological sense, but you're taking the term and seeing it as this algorithmic code that evolves through time, and like your books I think point out the signposts of that evolving algorithm.
Yeah, I mean, by signposts, you kind of mean thresholds.
Yeah, that's maybe a better word. Periods where there's a punctuation in the equilibrium, and there's a jump into a new kind of order of things.
Yeah, and I would say we're at one. I mean, and in a sense have been for some time, but I would say one way to describe the current moment is that we're at a point where technology is kind of pushing us and pulling us in the direction of global community, an actual cohesive kind of community where we quit having wars and stuff and spend more time working out common problems, and develop toward actual mutual understanding. And I would say what the Logos is saying now is you don't have to move in this direction, but the alternative is going to be really bad. I mean, that's, what wisdom is, among other things, I guess, is like avoiding the bad outcome, right? It's like understanding that whatever the short-term inclinations, if you want the long-term happy outcome, you need to proceed along certain paths. And I would say that that right now there's a crossroads. I don't want to be too dramatic, and I don't want to define now too narrowly. I mean, globalization has been in the process. This is, I guess I'd say if there's one book of mine that spells out the logos, although ironically doesn't mention it, it spells out my conception of the logos before I was really conversant in the ancient conception of the logos. It's the book Non-Zero. And that makes the argument that globalization has been proceeding for thousands of years in a certain sense. But we're at a point now where I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that there's no good alternative to global community. No alternative that's by and large good for human beings. And I guess one thing that might distinguish my worldview from the worldview of other people who are saying that about the current moment is I'm arguing that this was in the cards, in the sense that at least since technological evolution began in the human species, assuming we didn't get wiped out by a meteor or something, or some other catastrophic thing, we were bound to get to this point because technological evolution is a very powerful impetus and is itself a manifestation of the logos. Mm-hmm. So I think it was, and some people aren't interested in the question of whether it was inevitable that we get to this point. But if you are, I think it was, and I make that argument at length in the book, Non-Zero. And a thing I maybe didn't emphasize enough in the book, although I think it's clear and explicit, is that what happens next is not inevitable. Okay, that part is not. That part is up to us.
Yeah, and I as I flagged last night, page 9 of the Introduction to Non-Zero, in the paperback edition that I have, distills all of that, and given the fact that you were writing that in 1999, 2000.
Well, it's interesting. The hardcover and the paperback are in a way two different things. I don't know if that. So that's the introduction. And
you say, I can't resist, but you say health officials seriously discuss the prospect of worldwide plague, the unspeakably gruesome Ebola virus, perhaps, or some microbe we don't yet know about, spread around the world by jet-propelled travelers. And it goes on to predict this kind of apocalyptic potential. It is a test. The moment is a test of political imagination, our ability to accept basic necessary changes in structures of governance, but also a test of moral imagination.
Right. Yeah, no, that does kind of sum it up. I think that part would have been in the hardcover as well. And by the way, a pandemic is just a number of non-zero sum problems. That's why the name of the book is that's one reason the name of the book is Non-Zero. But there are a lot of non-zero sum problems right now that correlate. One thing, what a non-zero sum problem does is it makes your fate at least somewhat correlated with the other player in the game. Right. So, if the pandemic spreads out of China, it's bad for us. It's bad for Europe. I mean, if it spreads through China, it's bad for every people in China too, to begin with. It's bad for everybody. If we get it under control, it's not. Nuclear war, bad for everybody. Don't do it, better for us, and so on. And I think there are a lot of non-zero sum games that we face at a global, or in some cases regional level, but in any event, make cooperation the only alternative to a bad outcome. That's the logic that I argue favors moving toward global community. Just quickly back to the difference between the paperback and the hardcover. Hardcover came out in early 2000. Some people took it as more optimistic than I meant it. So if you compare the paperback introduction closely to the hardcover introduction, in the paperback, I drive home something more forcefully that I didn't say in the hardcover. It was like, we could have a very bad outcome, okay? This is not an optimistic book.
The line on the bottom of that page, on the other hand, we could blow up the world. Remember, even poppy seeds don't always manage to flower.
Right, because I had been using this poppy seed metaphor to describe what I meant by, well, purpose and destiny and so on. Yeah, I don't know if that's in the hardcover, but right. That's the kind of emphasis I added in early 2001. I added it before 9/11, but of course 9/11 started raising all these questions about globalization. It's like, oh, terrorists can organize globally, and they use the tools of communication, modern tools of communication, and so on and on and on. And yeah, I mean, I had mentioned that in the book as well. Yeah.
No, you know, I mean, it felt pretty prescient to me.
I wouldn't say I got everything right, but I mean, there are things that that in retrospect were less prescient, but broadly speaking, for better or worse, I think the worldview holds up.
And I forgive me for doing this, but I always try to listen with the ear for someone who's dropping in for the first time to hear, to encounter you and your worldview. And I just trying to share this with friends. The word non-zero can often kind of be kind of an abstract term that's not familiar to folks, and then they kind of tune out when I try to speak about it. So I hate to ask you to very briefly kind of just compare what a zero-sum game is to a non-zero-sum game, but and maybe to add to that, I was surprised, or kind of it did surprise me a little bit to read that you saw that these games get played all the way down at a biological level, like amongst cells, and presumably smaller bits than that, and that I felt that was quite interesting. I always thought it was just more of like primates and humans and other animals endowed with consciousness engaging in these games.
You're right. So first, quickly, you know, as I said, in a non-zero-sum game, the fortunes of the players are at least to some extent positively correlated. You know, classic zero-sum game, you're playing tennis with somebody. Every point is good for that other player exactly to the extent that it's bad for you. Okay? Your correlation, your fortunes are exactly inversely correlated. That's why the game is zero-sum. There's a winner, there's a loser. Their fortunes add up to zero. If you're playing doubles, then the person on your side of the net is in a entirely, like, extremely non-zero-sum relationship with you. Each point is either good for both of you or bad for both of you. Highly correlated fortunes. But any degree of positively correlated fortune means that it's not a purely zero-sum relationship. Biology, the interesting thing is how, well, broadly speaking, an interesting thing about natural selection is that it acts as if it were intelligent, even though it's not consciously intelligent, right? I mean, it quote, designs organisms that are these amazing feats of engineering, even though all it is this process of blind trial and error. It recognizes zero-sum and non-zero-sum logic in that sense. I mean, implicitly, unconsciously recognizes it. And so, just to start at the very beginning, if two genes are on the same strand, are in the same genome, like if you look at two genes on the same strand of DNA, or two you know, that are like right next to each other on a strand of DNA, it makes sense for them to work together, because the genes that fail to work together to construct an organism, a cohesive organism that is good at surviving long enough to get its genes in the next generation. Because if they don't cooperate, they're probably not going to get it in the next generation. And what natural selection says is that means we wave them goodbye. Okay, so natural selection favors genes that they don't think about it, but they wind up playing successfully non-zero-sum games with each other, which is to say they play them to a win-win outcome by the lights of natural selection. What we have with us is organisms full of genes that play nicely with each other to build the organism. There are actually little exceptions where you have genes that are, in a sense, they can be parasitic. They can do a good job of spreading themselves at the expense of the organism. I forget the details, but that's an asterisk anyway. By and large, or to move to a kind of a higher level of organization. I hope I'm getting this specific example right. Lynn Margulies is famous for her notion of symbiosis in the evolution of cells. So if you ask why, there are these prokaryotic, very simple cells, don't even have a distinct nucleus, and then there's the eukaryotic cells that finally came along and constitute us. And they have these little organelles, I think they're called, within the cells. And her argument is that they're used to, in some cases, these used to be separate cells, and they came together and merged. And I think the most likely scenario is that the merger was of a sort that we can call non-zero sum. Last time I checked, that was the most likely theory. In other words, coming together and forming a complex cell, like the mitochondria within the cell, which makes energy. It even has a whole different kind of genetic heritage. I think the deal is your mitochondria comes from your maternal line exclusively. So anyway, you start getting these things coming together for mutual benefit, and then individuals do that at the level of societies. I mean, ants. Without thinking about it, different ants cooperate in a way that is, well, it gets complicated if you say, in what sense is it good for all of them? Some sacrifice for the good of the colony and so on. But still, there's a kind of non-zero sum logic underlying that. And then finally you get to the point. I should stop talking soon. But
well, no, I mean, one thing you just brought up was the way that it can. I'm not sure I can speak to this correctly, but the way that it could either pivot towards an emphasis of selfishness or altruism, right? Like the organism could behave or act in ways that are self-serving, or with the notion of sacrifice of the ant that is more species serving in an altruistic sense.
Yeah, although it's important to appreciate at the same time that it's true that successfully playing non-zero sum games can be good for the species as a whole, or the group as a whole, or something else. At the same time, the basic idea in a non-zero sum game is that it can be selfish. It can make sense at a selfish level in a subtle way. So, you
think of an example where something's selfish for the individual, or is experienced or perceived as being selfish, and that it ultimately has an altruistic outcome?
Well, yeah. I mean, even to if you look at the way evolutionary psychology now explains the origin of the quote altruistic impulses. So, for example, my inclination to run into a burning building to save my offspring, if I did that, or say a sibling, we're more likely, we have this feeling of altruism in certain circumstances toward close kin. And that seems to have evolved through what's called kin selection. And at the level of the gene, that actually is selfish. Okay. Dawkins's book, The Selfish Gene, the title was misunderstood. That doesn't mean we're all actually selfish, because that's a case, kin selection, where I actually would sacrifice myself. I mean, I would run into a burning building, I suspect. I've never been put to the test, but if my daughters were in it, and that would actually be true altruism at the level of the individual, because I'm reducing my chances of living and increasing theirs. But at the level of gene, that is selfish. Now, if you look at the other kind of altruism explained by evolutionary psychologists. We believe successfully, I believe successfully explained, which is called reciprocal altruism, and which explains why even when we're dealing with non-relatives, we have all kinds of feelings like gratitude and affection for our friends, and we will do things for our friends. That is thought to have evolved because it was selfish, not just at the level of the gene, but at the level of the individual in the sense of, I mean, it was in the enlightened self-interest of people to strike up friendships. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, we'll both be more likely to survive. And that's another example of how it didn't just evolve as a conscious calculation among people. That's the reason it's governed by feelings. Is that, and you know, you can go find it in chimpanzees. You know, you can find reciprocal altruistic relationships in organisms that probably aren't consciously thinking about the benefits. So feelings evolved that are grounded in the genes that lead to behaviors that at an individual level might look altruistic, like, oh, today I give food to this person. But then tomorrow when I'm hungry and don't have any food, they give it to me. We both benefit from that relationship. It's non-zero sum. And that's a case where enlightened self-interest is what's governing the thing. So I just, and similarly today, like in the world, if you look around in the world, it would be great if more of us became more self-sacrificing, probably in some sense. I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to pay the ultimate sacrifice, and but that would be great. But the point is that even if we all just pursued our enlightened self-interest, we'd probably get through this thing. Okay, I mean, well, we're getting,
you know, off the enlightened self-interest for a moment, coming back to how feelings guide the development in a way, like the feeling of it feels good. The thought I had is that the feeling is not separated from the biochemistry that and the neuro phenomena that generate that feeling. And I don't know how much you thought about this, but I'm curious about it. Whether do you see epigenetic changes affecting gene expression as a vector of influence in this whole equation?
I don't know that it's critical, and I just don't know much about it. It's funny, when I wrote my book, The Moral Animal, about evolutionary psychology, that was 94, and even Non-Zero, which had a couple of chapters on biological evolution, which was book came out right at the very end of 99, early 2000. The whole epigenetic thing had not really taken off. I mean, we should say that I barely know enough about this to talk about it, even in summary. But the basic idea is that actually, you know, the expression of, well, I guess one way to say it is, you know, classically, what I learned in high school is that Lamarck was wrong. The environment doesn't, you know, infect biologically inherited characteristics. You can lift all the weights you want, but your child is going to be no stronger physically than they would have been if you had never lifted weights. Okay. That's not the way natural selection works. I think whether or not that is still true is unclear, but to me, because I haven't looked into this. But the idea behind these epigenetic phenomena is that it certainly kind of looks as if sometimes your environment really does infect the inheritance, the biological inheritance of the offspring sometimes. And at a minimum, what that means is that things that happen to one organism can influence the way the genes express themselves in the offspring. Okay. I think at a minimum, this epigenetic thing sometimes means that. I apologize for not having looked into it more deeply. And the reason I haven't is because I don't think, from the point of view of the philosophy, it matters a whole lot. In other words, there are various things that could speed up natural selection in a certain sense, or make it an even more adaptive mechanism than it might seem to be. For example, there's what they call the evolution of evolvability, which is to say that over time, organisms might, through biological evolution, develop mechanisms that increase the likelihood that new genetic traits will be adaptive. And in that sense, maybe, quote, random isn't exactly the right word for them, even though that would not be Lamarckian inheritance. So there are various ways, things that could speed up natural selection or make genetic changes even more adaptive than you might guess from just a plain vanilla description of Darwinism. From my point of view, that philosophically, I'm not sure they matter much, and that's why I haven't spent a lot of time on them. But it's a really interesting subject that everyone should look into, including me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, and I just keep hearing more and more about it in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it is sometimes wielded by people who think that, so the evolutionary psychologists are wrong and blah, blah, blah. And in my experience, these are people who really have not done their homework. Okay. They think its implications are more radical than I think they are, to the extent that I can tell.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I know you wanted to dive into looking at this moment, this political moment, through the lens of logos and your worldview. So why don't you want to tack into that?
Yeah, I've said a little about it. I've said, at a global level, I think we need a lot more global cooperation. I'm not exactly the first person to say that over the last 30 years. But to look at one of the great obstacles to global cooperation, which, some people call the psychology of tribalism, and then some people take offense at that term, but I haven't been able to find a better one. By the way, I don't think it should be offensive. It doesn't mean, if your own identity is in some more literal sense tribal, like let's say you're a Native American and you identify with the Navajo Nation or something, people might think that's tribal. I want to emphasize, when we talk about psychology of tribalism, we're not talking about a psychology that you see in these primitive people who might still be affiliated with tribes. No, it's exactly the opposite. The point is, it's a psychology that's universal in human beings. And this is, to my mind, was the big take home for me, at least, of evolutionary psychology. Anyway, we're all fundamentally alike. There is a human nature, and we are all, for better or worse, manifestations of it. We all face the same challenges. And in the case of the psychology of tribalism, which, you're seeing in American politics, more and more polarized, I would say this is something we need to transcend if we're going to solve the larger non-zero-sum problems at a global level, at a national level, whatever. And I think to transcend the psychology of tribalism, it helps to understand what it is. And I think evolutionary psychology helps explain why we have some of the cognitive biases that constitute the psychology of tribalism. Mm-hmm. I think one unfortunate thing about the term tribalism is some people, when they hear tribalism, they think, oh, okay, so warring tribes, they're full of rage and they're like using whatever weapons to kill each other, whatever image they have of tribal warfare. And a lot of the psychological mechanisms that impede our getting along with one another and drive polarization are actually subtler than that. There are things like confirmation bias, right? Like I'm only absorbing those pieces of information that sustain my view that my group is right and Trump supporters are evil, and then Trump supporters are subject to the same thing. And of course, this is exacerbated by technology that makes it so easy to be in separate information universes. But my point is that and other psychological biases or cognitive biases are are sometimes subtle. It's not just rage, hatred. These biases may get stronger the more enraged you are, the more you dislike the other group. But still, it's important to understand that these are, in some sense, cognitive biases affecting the way we process information about the world. And there's one cognitive bias that I think we should set aside a future conversation to really dwell on, because I think it's so underrated. I think you and I talked about it in a past conversation, but it wasn't one of these Dharma of Bob conversations, and that is attribution error. So let's just bracket that and promise to get back to it, because it's so fundamental and underrated, and I think is also particularly relevant to one of the techniques that you and I share an enthusiasm for as a way to start trying to combat the psychology of tribalism, which is, a contemplative practice, maybe mindfulness meditation, which I think is particularly well suited to the challenge. But in some future conversation, maybe we can drill down into that particular cognitive bias with reference to why meditation might help fight it, and why Buddhist philosophy might help illuminate it, even though I don't think like Buddhism is the only spiritual path to where we all want to go.
Right. But yeah, so there's a lot there. But with the current divide and the technological forces that seem to reinforce that divide, and the political incentive in a way to drive that polarization further, I guess I turn to someone like you to look for how might those things be healed? How might those things be bridged?
It's really hard. I mean, and I guess a sign of how hard it is the fact that my mind just immediately turned to like a really challenging discipline, mindfulness meditation. I mean, meditation to my mind is it's a challenging practice. It's not easy. It's the opposite of easy. It's going against the grain of our natural way of being. I mean, there are different, some people like to say, no, actually you're getting in touch with the natural you if you move toward, your Buddha nature. Okay, well, leaving aside those arguments, my point is it's very much the place you would want to get through mindfulness meditation, maybe through another contemplative practice, or maybe through cognitive behavioral therapy, or maybe just through reflection on the way you normally are and an intention to change it. But spell
out what you find. Define what you find hard about it. What's the hard piece?
Well, I mean, the feelings. The reason cognitive biases is a misleading term is that I think the biases tend to be triggered by feelings, right? In subtle ways. It's because you dislike the other group and you think you feel hostility toward them, that when they say something is true, your cognitive framework doesn't accept that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or at a subtler level, if you pay attention to the way confirmation bias works at kind of a micro level, like you see on Twitter some information that confirms your worldview. Your group is good, the other group is bad. If you pay enough attention, you'll see that you have a positive feeling toward that information. There's a feeling of embracing. You like that information. If you see information at odds with your view that your tribe is good and the other tribe is bad, there is a feeling of aversion. And that's the reason. And I think that drives the confirmation bias. Your feeling of aversion makes you interrogate it critically. Wait, are we sure about this premise of that? Are we sure about that? I'm going to go look into who actually said that. Is this a credible person? Whereas if it's information you like, you're not going to be so critical. You're like, oh, yeah, that's true. And what drives the idea that it's true is the feeling that it's good. You actually like it. So, and that's an example where we just normally aren't aware of those feelings. And that's what I mean by challenging. We were designed by natural selection to have these feelings guide our cognition with us not being aware of it. Because
and at one point in time, that was evolutionarily advantageous.
Right.
Correct?
At one point in time, these biases and the feelings that trigger them were adaptive. They must have been adaptive at the level of genes. In order, if they indeed now have a genetic basis, they must have been adaptive at the level of the genes, good for the genes. And I think in most cases, you would say they were also good for the individual, increase the individual's chances of surviving. Those aren't necessarily the same. As I said, I can help my genes by running into a burning building, saving my kids, for example. It is fair to say that these cognitive biases were much more productive at the level of the individual's survival and often psychological well-being, although those are another two things that aren't always the same. But now, much less so. And that's why now, for our own good, we need to become more aware of the biases. And to get back to the very beginning, I think that's what the Logos is telling us.
Yeah.
You know, that I think we were bound to get to this point, given that once human evolution was underway, maybe long before that, maybe once evolution was underway, because I personally think the evolution of some intelligent species, broadly speaking, like ours, was likely. Opinions differ on that, but I think it was. I think this, to a certain extent, for at least for some long time, whether you believe it was 10,000 years, a million years, or a billion years, this has been in the cards. And so if you buy this idea that we can use this concept of the Logos to describe all this, this is the message of the Logos. Become more self-aware, transcend the parts of you, and in particular of your cognitive biases that are not good for you or good for humanity broadly.
And maybe this is a paraphrase or a way of rephrasing it all, but the challenge and I've thought about this for a long time, but the challenge is that everyone sort of gets born into level one. You get born into the system of having all these cognitive biases wired in from the get-go, and we're in an environment now, the non-zero environment of an increasing demand for cooperation, which those biases make difficult. Right.
Right.
Siri's talking to me for a second.
Maybe this is a sign from the Logos. What did Siri say?
She said, "I didn't get that. Can you try it again?"
That's the logo. That is exactly. The Logos is more like, you didn't do it this time. Can you try that again? That's right. Where we are now. You keep not getting the picture. Can you try it again?
Yeah. But it's this picture that the environment, the evolutionary environment, in a way, is evolving through technological means and cultural means, and yet individuals are born into a stage of consciousness which, if they stay there, is imbued or driven largely by the cognitive biases that you're describing, and therefore puts them at odds with the new environment that we're in. Does that at all hold water for you, or is that kind of buggy
if I
thinking?
Caught what you were saying, I was still kind of reflecting on Siri as you said that. But so you're saying technology is pushing us into, in some sense, kind of alien environments, or?
Well, no, it's not an alien environment. Just it's an updated environment. It's a
yeah, but it's alien. I meant alien in the sense that it's less and less the environment we were engineered for by natural selection, and that's one reason we need to transcend some of the things that natural selection engineered into us. And none of this is to say, by the way, that things were rosy back before the invention of agriculture, when we were all living in an environment much more like the one evolution kind of engineered us for, right? It's because remember, I mean, it's not like natural selection's kind of short-term logic, which is to create animals that are good at getting genes into the next generation, is morally good. I mean, on the contrary, it's like full of pain and suffering and violence and hatred. And I mean, that all this stuff was built into us by this algorithm. And if there's going to be a redemption of the algorithm, so to speak, it's going to be when we reflect on it and what its legacy is and what parts of the legacy we do and don't want to hang on to, including things like, even though we're maybe designed by evolution to hunt and kill animals, maybe that's not nice. Maybe we should quit eating them. Maybe, questions like this.
I guess what I'm trying to articulate, though, is that, a population or an individual or a group could have that that developmental transcendence. They could transcend those early impulses. The predicament, though, is that individuals are still, the next generation comes on board, and they would have to do the same work of that self-transcendence in a way. You see what I'm saying?
You mean because the transcendence does not automatically transmit to the next generation?
Yeah.
That is sadly true. I mean, it's because Lamarck was broadly speaking right. You can lift weights and your kids won't be stronger. You can meditate and they won't be more enlightened unless the state of mind you're in as you raise them is more conducive to enlightenment. Their enlightenment, is that, am I still not getting your point, or is that closer?
I think that's my point. That's close to my point.
Yeah, it takes, but the good news is cultural evolution is cumulative. I mean, as we come to understand things, we build institutions that help propagate the understanding. I mean, look at science, right? We have universities. There are arguments afoot about how good a job certain social science departments are doing of that. And I don't want to get into that, but certainly if you look at, science, quote, hard science, physics, chemistry, biology, there's an accumulation of learning. We develop institutions that propagate the stuff that seems true. And sometimes we get it wrong and we hang on to a false idea for a while, but on balance, comprehension grows. And there's no reason. And I think you can say humankind's spiritual development has some of that property. It's harder maybe, but it has some of that.
Well, you can flag that for another conversation too. I would like to hear your thoughts around whether university social science departments are logos aligned or not.
That is an angle that would take us back to Jordan Peterson, wouldn't it? He would have views on that, and he uses the term the logos as we mentioned last time around. But so yeah, it's but look, in a way, it's an exciting time to be alive. I mean, this is an epic challenge. People like epic challenges, right? I mean, people, that's kind of the irony, I guess. I mean, it's like I've been listening to, not to date this conversation, because I hope that people will be listening to it weeks, months, maybe even years from now, but
decades.
I've been listening to, it's a bad habit in some ways, but I listened to this Steve Bannon podcast. He is, of course, this key Donald Trump advisor. And I mean, he clearly has an audience of people who are getting their psychological sustenance out of the idea that they are at a war with evil. They're in war with people like me, I guess, and we are evil. And then the so-called resistance, the anti-Trump forces, it's long been clear that many of them, as much as they might, and of course I'm not a Trump fan, I share that part of the worldview, but as much as they might fulminate with rage and seem unhappy, you can see their lives are getting meaning. out of this epic challenge. This is the evil we have to confront. Well, in my view, a more productive channeling of this is the evil we must unite to fight mentality, which is, I think, built into us by natural selection, would be the one I'm describing. It's like, wait a second. It's like the enemy is the apocalypse. It is the chaos that could engulf the world if we don't all get better at transcending some of the impulses and cognitive biases that are driving this particular political conflict in America right now. But it's a little harder to enlist people in that cause, that because the enemy is not a group of people in a sense. I mean, it is in the sense that the enemy is all of us. The enemy is the things we by our nature do. But the enemy is not this one group of people that are doing the bad thing, whereas your group is doing the good thing. No, the idea is we're all to some extent doing the bad thing. Mm-hmm. And it's a challenge. And you can argue that some people are even more unenlightened than others. Fine. But it's probably not productive to dwell on that. A and B in any event. I think.
Are there any recent signs of optimism from your perspective around how at this threshold within this particular political transition there might be signs of transcendence coming?
I guess I'd say yes and no. I mean, I think some of the backlash against what's called call-out culture or cancel culture is productive. In the last issue of this newsletter I put out with some other people, the Non-Zero newsletter, we linked to a piece in the New York Times about this woman who she teaches at Smith College. She would, I think, conventionally be classified as a black radical leftist, probably, but she's got this idea of replacing calling out with calling in, which is to say, when somebody says something you consider outrageous, address it privately and with compassion and with understanding. It's like, so that kind of thing is productive. I don't want to get off on this so much, but I do think that some groups that have styled themselves as transcending this tribalism and opposing call-out culture themselves have their blind spots. I don't even want to get into it more than that. They have prohibitions of free speech that they themselves actually abet, whether they know it or not, in certain areas. And so, but that's just, I would be guilty of that too. There's definitely, because of my political leanings, there's forms of call out and cancellation that drive me crazier than others. And there are speech codes that I'm less unhappy about than others. But still, I do think there's more and more acknowledgement that we have a serious problem here. I think the fact that more people are talking about polarization, tribalism, that's a start. But man, we've really got some work to do. Yep. And not just in America, but I think our foreign policy is infused by the same kind of quote tribalistic thinking, and that's not widely recognized.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think you that all of that is part of the vision that you have, and it's a chilling threshold that we're at. I think. I mean,
it's that you would hope that would get people like geared up. It's like almost literally apocalyptic. We could blow up we have enough nuclear weapons to, like, I don't know, probably actually end human life. I haven't done the math. I mean, probably if you fired them randomly around the globe, right, which you wouldn't do, I guess, the fire would be concentrated mainly between Russia and the U.S., get a little China action, and a few other countries. But probably probably the species, but the point is, imagine how bad it would be. Okay, we're talking epic, yeah, and of course, climate change. There are more of these kinds of problems than I think is appreciated. Climate change is the one we hear most about. I think there are more, and that's epic, right? It's like almost literally apocalyptic. Well, the apocalypse should get you kind of geared up, right? I mean, that's what I'd like. But again, the easiest to activate. It's not the easiest form. It's not the easiest way to activate the kind of quote tribal impulses. In other words, you'd like us to consider ourselves all on this planet. You just realize, oh shit, we're all in the same tribe, and the enemy is in some sense within us, but it's not like this distinct group of people. But again, it's hard to marshal that particular sense of tribalism. I don't think it's impossible. It's just more challenging for reasons. On a future occasion, we could get into the dynamics of social media and the incentive structure that they present. There's all kinds of challenges, but it's a tough one. But I'd certainly like to, invite people listening to this to think of ways to participate in the cause if they find these arguments compelling. And I appreciate your willingness to have these conversations. And
I very much enjoy being able to try to pick through your worldview, because it really does. I always appreciate, either I listen to you or read some of your books. It's like a comparison. I remember reading the liner notes of a compact disc by the Emerson String Quartet, and one of the I think the violist was referring to the Art of the Fugue by Bach, and said whenever he listens to Bach, he said it feels like his whole perceptual windshield is cleared, and he's able to see and tune into things much more clearly. And I feel like, again, these signposts that you point out of the evolution of the logos, they really, once you grok them conceptually to some degree, they light up. You see them lighting up, like if you learn a new word, you suddenly see that word appearing everywhere. But these structural dynamics and developments really do line up or light up when someone has a handle of them. They start to see them everywhere, and I think that's the value there.
If all this conversation had done was get me compared to Bach in however oblique a sense, I would consider it time well spent. Hasn't happened before, God knows. So thanks. I know that you and I both have a quote hard out, as they say in the media business, in 3 minutes. Mine is going to involve another person actually showing up on this very Zoom platform. It's great that Zoom did finally institute this thing where you have the option, you have to actively let people into the conversation. Otherwise, this person would just literally show up, and actually that would make for an interesting conversation. But anyway, that's not going to happen. But so we have to go. Why don't you tell us about your own? I failed to introduce you at the beginning adequately. You are, among other things, a yoga teacher with a podcast and so on. You want to just talk a little about where people can find your stuff?
I'm a yoga teacher of the podcast, but more importantly, and I've been trying to think about this on my own, like what is my relevance to this conversation? And as I reread or started to reread The Moral Animal recently, it occurred to me that had I read that book at the right time, that could have had a very decisive influence on the direction my life took. Because I was in the mid '90s, I was a cultural anthropology student at the university, and completely awash in what I would call the infection of postmodern theory on that discipline. And I was drawn to it for things that you describe in The Moral Animal, but wasn't really finding in my university degree, and then kind of in a way where I became a little bit of a drift. I went to Asia for a while and got into yoga more and meditation, and then sort of cobbled together a livelihood around that. But intellectually, I've always been quite interested, if only cursorily aware, but interested in the themes that you talk about, like these evolutionary themes that influence the way we see things, and how to transcend them. And so that's sort of where I just, in conversing with you, I hope to help your view and your articulation of your worldview more relevant and accessible to others.
Well, that's what I'm grateful for. And although I never discourage people from reading my books, or never, as a rule, never wish they hadn't. I mean, if reading it had taken you on a different path, we might, for all we know, have never met. So that would,
right,
and not be having this conversation. So in this case, I'm glad you.
But if anyone is new to the listenership here, definitely check out your books, Moral Animal, Non-Zero. They're very entertaining and eminently readable, and just, the upgrade of that perceptual lens way, they will change the way people see things, for sure.
I don't discourage that. And if anyone is interested in yoga, check out your podcast, The Everyday Sublime. That's the title, right?
Yep.
Or just Google you. You're like this. You're like, you're a celebrated yoga figure.
As well,
I'm celebrating you. I'm celebrating you. So
quietly, so I mean, there's yoga people and there's yoga people, and I appreciate yoga and I enjoy sharing it. But it's just yoga. I
mean, you also, I should say, you've done a lot of meditate, more than I have, I think. I mean, you've been I mean, not to get competitive, you've been to more retreats probably, and so on.
We'll troll out.
You know a lot about that, and parts of meditative tradition that I'm less well versed in, and I think so our future conversations will probably benefit from that. So the person who would be bursting in here if I didn't have this screening mechanism has arrived, so I guess we should go. But thank you. And as people can tell, I think there's more for us to say. So we will be doing that. Rest assured.
We'll be back.
Okay.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Thanks so much, Bob.
Okay. Thank you, Josh.